All right, now that we've learned all about the basics of photography with exposure, we can now jump into the next level of complexity and the next most important thing, focus. So, when we refer to focus, we're referring to whether something is sharp in the image or not. And usually we are specifically directing where we want the image to be the most sharp. And usually that's on our subjects and the things that we're concentrating on, or we want the viewer to look at in the image. Now, there's a lot of things that focus can be used for, and there's so much to fine tune when it comes to focus, so much so that they developed autofocus. Yes, autofocus, the thing that sounds so simple, and I'm sure you've encountered it when you've taken a photo on any camera in the modern age, really. Historically, focus was done manually by turning rings on a lens so that it would shift the optical elements within the lens to into alignment for a given distance away. And, because of this, it used to be very slow and very cumbersome, and, it still is. Many lenses today have manual focus and autofocus, but even still now with modern technology, autofocus can be a little bit difficult and the options can be quite confusing because there's just so many of them, there's so much to learn. And even though it's come a long way, the technology still isn't perfect. So we need to understand how to make the most out of the power that autofocus can provide us. And in today's lesson, we're going to be going over the differences between manual focus and autofocus, and then all of the different types of autofocus configurations we can use, such as modes, speeds, and areas. But first, the basics. So, smart technology aside, focus is really about determining how far away your subject is and then focusing to that distance. With the act of focusing, it's not really about the subject per se. In reality, we're not focusing on the subject at all. Rather, when you're focusing on something, what you're really doing is telling the camera to focus a specific distance away from you. And your subject also happens to be at that distance within the depth of field as well. And again, it's almost like you're fishing, right? You cast a line out, into the distance, a certain distance away, and only the kind of fish nearby will be able to see it, right? And when you're telling the camera to focus, that's pretty much what you're doing. You're throwing the focus distance out there. You're throwing it a distance away, and you're telling the camera to focus that distance away from you. Now, this is an important idea to understand because this is the basics of focus, whether it's for manual or for automatic focus. And sure, there are smart things like, eye tracking and subject tracking and all these other new like AI technologies and features that are coming out, and we'll get to all of that. But the fundamentals of focusing is that you're telling the camera how far away something is in the distance and aligning the focus to that particular distance. Now, in the beginning, all lenses were manual lenses. Lenses had very simple optical designs, and they had and still do today have rings on them that you would turn in order to get the image into focus. Those things would shift the optical elements such that it would make it go into focus. And sometimes you would turn those rings clockwise, and sometimes they would be anti-clockwise, and it all just kind of depends on the manufacturer of that lens. But in all, it was a slow and clunky experience. And one of the problems with manual focusing, as we learned in the previous aperture lesson, is that depth of field can be tricky. And while a large depth of field is most certainly easier to shoot with, a shallow depth of field can be extremely hard to get right if you have to manually focus on a subject, and significantly more when that subject is moving, like in a portrait, for example. So can you imagine like having to focus a foot's worth of depth of field on a moving subject, right? You'd have to be able to control and rack the focus back and forth so accurately, and it's so tough. And so if you have a lens handy right now, you can literally try this for yourself and you'll know exactly how hard this is. Manual focus requires practice. It's not impossible, but I don't really suggest that you start there as a beginner, as there are more important things to learn when you're first starting out. And after all, technology has moved forward in significant ways since then, and it's worth learning this new technology as well, because now we have autofocus, and we have technology in our lenses and in our sensors that help us accurately place the focus to where we want to without having to manually rack the focus ring back and forth. And this is absolutely fantastic because not only does it mean that we are more accurate at focusing than we would have been by doing it by hand, but we're also faster at doing it as well. So both accurate and faster. If you recall my portrait photography example in the earlier lesson, sometimes depth of field can be literally the difference between, the eyelash and the iris being in focus. And, it can be that shallow. And because humans move back and forth all the time, even without realizing these micro movements, right? Doing this manually is so difficult to get exactly right every single time. But with things like eye tracking technology, our cameras do all of this for us. And that frees us to then concentrate on other things like composition and other settings. As another example, this video you're watching right now has the autofocus set to eye tracking. The camera is literally focusing on my eye right now as I move back, forth, left, and right. And the entire time I know my eyes are going to be in focus, even though my microphone is right there and you can hear that I am literally further away, right? And again, this is huge. It reduces the amount of things you need to think about and it allows you to focus your attention on other things. But like all things, autofocus has a learning curve and there are certainly certain settings that do certain things. And in order to make the most out of your autofocus, then we need to learn how to do them all. Now, one of the most important concepts about autofocus is whether or not you want your autofocus to focus on a single point and then lock on to that something at a distance, or whether you want your autofocus to continually pull on a particular area in case the subject within that area moves. Now, sometimes the different manufacturers call them different things, but when it comes to focus mode, it's going to be manual, single point, or continuous. On the Sony systems, they call single and continuous AFS and AFC, respectively. On the Canon systems, they call it one-shot AF and servo AF. Now, occasionally, depending on how new your camera is, you might have an automatic mode. And this is a mode where the camera decides whether or not it thinks you want a single point autofocus or a continuous point autofocus, depending on the scene that you're photographing. Now, we're not going to be focusing on this because it's only a little bit useful once you understand how AFS and AFC work. And most of the time, honestly, it's kind of unreliable. Having to rely on your camera for this kind of thing is not always that good, at least for now. Okay, so focusing on the single point style of focusing modes, this is the easiest focus mode to understand. When you half press the shutter button to focus, whatever point you are focusing on locks into position. And it might help to think of this in terms of the distance between you and the subject, right? So when you're using AFS, you're telling the camera, hey, the thing that is in front of me that is 30 meters away or however far it is, focus on that distance away and lock that distance until I focus again next time. And this is great for things like landscapes or architecture because mountains and buildings, they don't move, right? And usually when you're shooting them, you're usually not moving either. So the focus will remain locked and in place and nice and steady. Very predictable behavior in this focus mode. The general thing to remember with AFS is if your subject is not moving, then AFS is probably the right thing to use. AFC, however, is where things get a little bit more interesting. So AFC is the continuous version of autofocus, and it's probably one of the most powerful things about modern cameras, and certainly a very big selling point when considering upgrading or purchasing a new camera body. Having really great autofocus is really about your camera being able to find what you're looking for quickly and in a very snappy manner. Now, AFC works in that you select a point in your composition and the camera will constantly poll that position and distance for focus. Even if the object in that point of focus moves closer or further away, whatever the case is, that point should always be in focus. Now, this is fantastic for subjects that are moving because then you can continually update that point and match that with whatever you are shooting. So say for example, you have a focus point in the center of your image and you're taking a photo of someone who is walking away from you, right? Now, because the distance between the camera and the subject is getting further and further away, if you were to use AFS, it would then focus on that person at that point in time that you focus, but then it would stay there. And because the person is walking away, there's a very, very high chance that the person could walk out of the depth of field very quickly and then become blurry. And you would have to like refocus and reacquire that focus at the new distance that person was at. However, with AFC, so long as the person is within the focus point, the camera will continuously update that focus point relative to whatever is in there. So if you're tracking a person walking away, regardless of how far that person goes, as long as they're in that focus point in the center in this option, then they will be in focus. And this is the real revolutionary part of autofocus. It's the ability to constantly pull for focus. However, it's at this point where I'll say that most people struggle with autofocus because they don't understand the modes and the points well enough. And the reliability of the autofocus is determined really by two things: how fast your camera continually can pull that position, and also the focus point that you use. Now, when it comes to how fast your camera pulls, most of the time, most modern cameras are more than fast enough for most people. So don't be too scared of that consideration. It's only when you know that you need a faster polling rate that you genuinely need the technology to keep up. And, I'm referring to super high speed sport and journalism and street photography scenarios here. But for 99% of the time, most modern cameras are going to be fine. Rather, most people actually trip up when it comes to the second point, which is the focus point. Now, the focus point or the focus area is the real secret to getting your autofocus working correctly whenever you need it to, and for whatever scenarios that you specifically need that to work in. With the focus point or the focus area, you're telling the camera the specific portion of that composition that you require autofocus to perform in. Without this, your autofocus will just kind of go everywhere and your camera will decide on like any old thing that it thinks is important, and that may or may not be what you need to actually have in focus. So this is a really important idea to understand. Now, when it comes to focus points or areas, again, different manufacturers will call them different things and have different labels and titles and stuff like that. But most of the time, they're broken down into some kind of like wide focus area, some kind of zoned focus area, and some kind of spot focus area. And when selecting the wide focus area, what you're doing is you're telling the camera to look at the entire scene and then figure out what is the most important thing and then focus on that. And most of the time, you can see what it's focusing on by, there's little green squares usually that it's deciding, what things are in focus, and it shows you what is in focus in that instance. And most of the time, unless you are using eye tracking, which I'll cover in just a moment, this usually isn't the mode that you will want to use for maximum control. Using a wide mode will usually focus on whatever is the largest and usually the most closest point in your scene. And most of the time, that's what the camera will actually think is important. And depending on the scenario, if that is what is important to you, then maybe you might be wanting to use the wide focus area. Using the zoned focus area is a little bit more specific and definitely usable. It's, again, different for every manufacturer, but Sony calls this the zone focus and will divide the composition into 9 portions. And you can kind of control the zone that you want to be in focus with the joystick or the dial. This can be useful for things like landscapes when you need some level of specificity with your focus, but not so much that you're slowing down your process either. And then finally, we have the spot focus mode. Again, there are many names for this. Sony calls them center, flexible spot, or spot. There's a whole bunch of different ones. And basically the idea here is that you're given a box of varying sizes, and you can move them around the scene using the joystick or the dial buttons. And this is where things get very, very specific, and there are so many different kinds of uses for this. Now, some of those uses might be that, perhaps you are doing a portrait and you want the eyes to always be in a specific portion of the composition, right? Or maybe it is a street scene that you're shooting that has a very particular laneway of varying depths. Or perhaps you're shooting a landscape and you have something in the foreground that you want to keep in your composition as bokeh and it's quite large, but you want to make sure that that thing is not in focus and you're using the spot to focus on your main subject instead. Now, there's way too many uses for it, and it's most certainly up to you to decide which you want to use and experiment with how you want to be focusing. In modern cameras these days, we have eye tracking, subject tracking, and even sometimes animal tracking, depending on how high-end your camera is. Now, these kinds of tracking modes are really interesting because they work in conjunction with autofocus continuous and some kind of focus point. But rather than saying, hey, focus in this point and continually pull the distance within this point, tracking intelligently looks at the focus area and tries to identify the object that you're trying to track and then changes the autofocus based on that thing. So in the case of eye autofocus, tracking will see that you have a thing in your frame that is a human face. Faces have a very common structure. So the camera is then able to figure out what that structure is and provide you with a focus point on the eyes. And once it's locked onto the eye, then we're able to concentrate on other things like composition, knowing that the eyes are always going to be in focus. Very, very cool. And this is where modes like wide focus area and zone focus areas are amazingly convenient. By providing the camera with a very broad range of area to focus in, the camera can then intelligently decide where the eyes are correctly and then lock them in based on a focus area. From there are more general tracking modes like subject tracking. Usually these are instigated via the more specific focus modes like the spot focus mode. And in these modes, the camera intelligently analyzes your focus point for what it thinks you are focusing on, and then turns that thing into an object and tracks it. And this works a lot better on the higher end cameras, that's what you're paying for at the end of the day. But generally, once you have a subject selected, you can then move the scene around and that subject will still be focused and locked on. And of course, because this is autofocus continuous, regardless of the distance the subject is to your camera, it should always be in focus. Now, keep in mind that not all cameras have these kinds of smart tracking features, and it's usually a great idea not to rely on them too much as they can be kind of a crutch to begin with. I would recommend learning the basics of focus first without using any of the smart tracking tools, and then you'll have a much better foundation of how to use those tracking tools down the road. Now, kind of related to focus is drive speed, or how fast your camera takes images in bursts. Most cameras can control how fast the next image gets taken when you press down the shutter. And having the ability to hold the shutter down and take many, many images very, very quickly is super useful for things like portraits and street photography where milliseconds matter. Expressions in the face change in an instant. Silhouettes move, and the slightest change in degree can mean the difference between a successful image and an image where someone has their eyes closed like this by accident. Henri Cartier-Bresson was a very famous French street photographer, and he's often quoted for talking about what he calls the decisive moment. It's this idea where there is one very specific moment in the timeline of moments that is the moment of expression that surmises the entire timeline of the moment. Like if you're taking photos of someone, there is a fraction of a second where there's the perfect expression in that little moment, that one fraction of a second that gives the expression that sums up that entire moment. And having a very fast burst drive speed can be very powerful so that we can take lots of images in a moment and cherry pick the best image in that little series of images to best represent that entire moment. And this is why when there's, a press event on TV, you hear all you hear is the sound of shutters going off, right? It's because, there's micro expressions that at the moment that is worth capturing. And so long as the focus is locked on and correct, one of those frames in that series of burst images is going to be worth keeping. Now, why I mention this is kind of related to focus in that, when you're shooting continuously, the camera constantly needs to focus and refocus every single time between every single shot you take. And in most cameras, the sensor will be readjusting so quickly, many times within each shot of the burst. So, my Sony A1, for example, performs 120 autofocus and auto exposure tracking calculations per second. Now, this is absolutely overkill for most people, and it's very unlikely that your camera will perform this kind of insane speed. However, it's important to note that if you're a burster kind of photographer, right, someone who loves using a very high burst rate all of the time, know that the reason why you only might get a few images out of focus or something like that in your burst series is because your camera probably can't keep up with the subject and isn't refocusing quick enough between the shots between your burst. All right, today's lesson has been a bit of a long one, and we've covered a bunch of stuff in the process, but the things to remember here about focus is that focus is very much related to the things we've already learned. Things like depth of field, shutter speed, aperture, all of those things are related to how we make the subjects in our images sharp. And they all build on one another and all have relationships with one another. Now, when it comes to focus, the two things you have to remember is that focus is split up into two parts, focus mode and focus area. Focus mode determines whether the focus locks on once and is great for landscapes and other subjects that don't move, or whether it continually focuses on a given area, which is great for moving subjects. The focus area, on the other hand, is how you tell the focus system in your camera exactly which area in your composition to focus on. So wide, zone, spot, along with a bunch of other improvements in smart tracking like, eye tracking and subject tracking, allow us the ability to specifically dial in where we want to focus on with amazing precision. But it's also the focus area side of things that many beginners struggle on. And so make sure to spend some time getting used to all of these different focus modes and exactly how to use them. It'll help you tremendously down the road and increase your odds of sharp photos every time. Alrighty, assignment time. So we've got a few things to practice for today's assignment. We've got focus modes, focus areas, and drive speeds to play around with. Now, the thing is that a lot of these settings will be determined by your camera, and not all cameras have all of the speeds or all of the areas or all of the features, because of course they don't. Now, because of that, we need to know our gear a little bit better and understand our gear a little bit better so that we can know its abilities and its limitations. So what I want you to do today is go outside and take photos in whatever genre or whatever environment that you're comfortable in. But when you do so, I want you to spend 15 minutes shooting in fully manual focus, right? Then spend another 15 minutes in some kind of single autofocus mode like AFS, and then spend another 15 minutes in a continuous focus mode like AFC. Vary up the subject matter that you're shooting while you're doing so. And what you're trying to look for is which modes you can start to get comfortable with and start to understand, and what modes are good for your camera. In most cases, you'll find that AFC will be good for your camera, and you'll find that manual focus is really hard. Some cameras and setups can be really slow to autofocus continuous on. But most of them will be fast on autofocus single. Some cameras, like the higher end stuff, have such good continuous autofocus that you can just continuously leave autofocus continuous on all of the time. That's personally what I do. From there, play around with the different focus areas and see what speaks to you. A very common approach is using the AFS plus the center focus area. In the old days before good continuous autofocus was around, the idea of focusing on your subject in the middle with a half press and then continuing to hold that focus while recomposing your image and moving the camera around was a very popular technique called focus recompose. And that's one thing to potentially play with and get used to. Another one is that some cameras have the touchscreen or a joystick at the back, and a lot of people love to use this as the focus point and move it around depending on their shot. A lot of people have success with that. There are some cameras out there that you can have to your eye to the viewfinder, and you can use the touchscreen even though it's off as the focus picker. Personally, I use all of the technology that I can get. And I actually nowadays use pretty much just one setting, which is AFC plus a center and a subject tracking kind of mode. And I do a kind of new school focus recomposing, but this requires some of the better gear, so you may be limited in this space, but at least you can learn the focus recompose from a single focus point mode. Regardless, there are so many different ways to focus, and today's assignment is to get a better understanding of all of them and find out what works for you and your current level of gear. So get out there and experiment. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.